The cold had settled in hard that night, the kind that finds its way through old barn siding and sits on your chest like a hand pressing down. I was on my knees in the straw with my arm inside a heifer named Pear, trying to find a hoof that had folded back the wrong way, and Roo was at the barn door with his ears up and his tail stopped mid-wag, standing absolutely still in a way he had not stood still in 18 months. I looked at him. He did not look back at me. He was watching something out in the dark, and the lantern flame on the hook above my head had gone perfectly steady, and the cold air that had been slipping through the gap at the bottom of that door all night had simply stopped moving. I want to be clear about what I mean when I say I was not afraid. I mean my body understood something before my mind caught up, and what it understood was not danger. That is the part I have turned over 1,000 times since, and it is the part I still cannot explain in any language I was raised to trust. But to understand why I was in that barn at 3 a.m, with a heifer in trouble and a stone that was not my own sitting on my fence post the next day, I need to go back to the week that started it all, and further back than that, to the 18 months that came before. Della died in early April, a year and a half before that March night. It was fast in the way that some things are fast, where you go from believing something is manageable to standing at a gravesite in 6 weeks, and your brain has not caught up to any of it. She had been the one who baked on Sunday mornings. That was the first thing I noticed missing. Not the silence in the bed, not the 2-cup habit I could not break for 3 months, but the smell of cornbread at 7 a.m. She had a cast-iron skillet she'd had since before I knew her, and she'd bake a pan of cornbread every Sunday without exception, and she always broke off the heel and walked it out to the fence post at the edge of the yard, the cedar post nearest the tree line, and left it there for whatever came by. She said something was always watching the property, and it deserved a little something warm. I thought it was a sweet habit, and I never gave it much examination. She fed barn strays, and she left cornbread on a post, and she talked to the heifer calves like they were children, and she kept a hand-drawn map of every tree on the 42 acres, taped to the inside of the pantry door. These were the things that made up Della, and I had taken them for granted the way you take air for granted, right up until there was no more of it. The first Sunday after her funeral, I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I was not hungry. I had not been properly hungry since the hospital, but I found the skillet in the cabinet where she kept it, and I found the cornmeal and the buttermilk, and I made cornbread the way she had shown me years ago, and it came out lopsided and too dark on one side, and I broke off the heel anyway, and carried it out to the fence post. I did not think about it much. My hands did it before I had a plan. I kept doing it every Sunday after that. I do not know why exactly. I could tell you it was grief and you would accept that. And you would be right, but it was also just the only thing I did those first weeks that had any shape to it. The rest of the days had no shape. I stopped cooking real meals. I worked the 42 acres because the animals needed working, and the fences needed fence, and the firewood wasn't going to split itself. And at the end of every day, I came inside and ate crackers or a tin of something, and went to bed with my boots still on half the time. The property kept me functional. The Sunday cornbread kept me human, or close enough. Roo was the one who held me accountable on the worst days. He was 9 years old that spring, a blue Gila mix Della had named after a stuffed kangaroo she'd had as a girl, which I will admit I found embarrassing to say at the feed store. He was grey around the muzzle by then, and he moved carefully going down the porch steps, but he was a dog who believed deeply in routine and in being wherever I was. And when I sat too long at the kitchen table in the dark, he would put his chin on my knee and wait. He was not a dramatic animal. He did not whine or pace. He just put his chin on my knee and waited until I got up. Those 18 months were the longest I had lived. I want to say that plainly so you understand the condition I was in when March came around again. The second March without her. The land looked the way it always did in early spring, that particular grey-green that comes before anything fully commits to growing. And Pear had been showing for 6 weeks, and I had been watching her with the attention I used to divide between her and Della, and now had nowhere else to go. Pear was a first calf heifer, 2 years old, dark red with a white patch behind her left ear that was shaped something like a mitten. First calf heifers are where dystocia starts, if it's going to start. The pelvis is still developing, the calf is proportionally large relative to the birth canal, and if the presentation goes wrong, it goes wrong fast and it goes wrong hard. I had spent 6 years working dairy before I bought this land, and I had been through enough malpresentations to know the difference between a heifer who is labouring normally and a heifer who is in trouble. Pear started showing contractions around 9 in the evening, and by 10 I could see she was straining without progress, and by 10:30 I knew what I was dealing with. A front leg had folded back. That is the simplest way to describe it. When a calf presents, you want 2 front feet and the nose between them, like a diver. What you get with a malpresentation is sometimes a leg tucked under the chest, and then the shoulder jams and nothing moves, and the heifer wears herself out pushing against a problem that won't solve itself by pushing. You have to go in and find the leg and bring it forward, and you have to do it between contractions, which means you are working in small windows, with your arm in a place it was not designed to be. I scrubbed up at the water barrel and got the OB sleeve on my right arm, the long plastic sleeve that goes past the elbow. Calvin Briggs had dropped a spare one at my gate 2 days before, said his cousin had left a box of them after selling his herd, and he figured I might want them with Pear looking close. He had handed them over the gate and said, "Figured you'd need these," and climbed back in his truck and driven out without waiting for me to say anything more than thank you. 4 words. I have thought about those 4 words more than once since that night. I worked Pear for 2 hours before the leg came forward. I want you to understand what 2 hours in that position feels like. Your arm goes numb from the shoulder down. The heifer is straining against you, her whole body working against the one thing that would help her. And you are trying to stay calm because she can feel what you feel. And if you go tense, she goes tense. And then nothing happens that should happen. I talked to her the whole time. Low, plain talk, the same way Della had talked to the calves. I told her what I was doing and why, and that she was going to be all right. And I did not know for certain that was true, but it seemed better than silence. Around midnight, the leg came forward and the calf began to move. I attached the calf puller at that point, a simple chain and bar arrangement I'd had since the dairy days, and began working with her contractions instead of against them. The barn was cold. The lantern I'd hung on the center hook threw a yellow circle on the straw and left the corners dark. Rue had been lying near the door, his head on his paws, sleeping, or close to it. He was not a barn dog by nature. He preferred the porch. The fact that he had come in at all when I'd pulled on my coat said something about how he understood the night. 2 in the morning, and then 2:30, and the calf was moving but slowly, and Pear was tiring in the way that a heifer tires when the work has gone on longer than it should. I was managing her, keeping her from going down too hard, adjusting the chain, working in the windows. My right arm had stopped having a temperature. I was aware of the cold the way you are aware of furniture in a room you know well, which is to say, I registered it without giving it much thought. And then Rue stood up. He did not stand up the way a dog stands up when he hears a car on a road a mile off, which is all at once, and with his ears swiveling. He stood up slowly, the way he stood up when something had his complete and careful attention, and he walked to the barn door, which I had left open 2 or 3 inches for the air, and he stood there with his muzzle pointed at the gap, and his tail stopped exactly where it was. I noticed the lantern first, which I know sounds backwards, but the flame had been guttering all night in the draught from the door, and it went still, the way a flame goes still when all the air movement in a space stops at once. And that stillness pulled my eyes upward. Then I looked at Rue, and then I looked at the door. The gap at the bottom had gone dark in a different way than the rest of the barn was dark. The rest of the barn was the dark of inside space at 3 in the morning, with a lantern burning, a dark you can see through. The gap at the bottom of the door was the dark of something blocking it, something large, something very close to the wood. I did not move. I am not sure I breathed. Rue's tail moved once, a slow, single wag, and then it stopped again. That was the moment I told you about. That was the moment my body understood something my mind had no category for, and what it understood was not danger. I had been in situations that registered as dangerous. I knew what fear felt like in my chest. That specific tightening below the sternum that tells you to move or make yourself small. This was not that. This was something closer to the feeling you get when someone you trust walks into a room you've been sitting in alone for a long time, except there was no one I was expecting, and the door had not opened. I stayed on my knees beside Pear. She was in a contraction, and I kept my hand where it needed to be. But I kept my eyes on that door. The door eased open. Not fast, not slow, just open. The way a door opens when something leans against it from the outside. It opened maybe a foot, maybe a little more, and the cold air came back in, but quieter than it had been, like the space outside the door was mostly filled. It was standing at the threshold. I will not tell you exactly what it looked like, because I am not sure I can do it accurately, and I would rather be short of the truth than past it. I can tell you it was tall enough that the door frame did not come close to the top of it. I can tell you it was dark-furred and broad-shouldered in a way that had nothing to do with any animal I had ever seen, and I had been around large animals my whole working life. I can tell you it stood still with a stillness that was not the stillness of something hiding or preparing. It was the stillness of something that had chosen to be present and was making no apology for it. Its eyes caught the lantern light. They were dark, and they were looking at me, and they were not hostile. I am spending a long time on this point because it is the most important point. There was no aggression in that gaze, no alarm, no threat. There was something I can only describe as attention. Patient, unhurried attention directed at the barn and at what was happening inside it. I've told this part to one person since it happened. Not a full telling, just a few sentences, out in my own yard. And even saying those few sentences, I understood why it had taken me months to say anything at all. Rue did not bark. He did not back up. He sat down on the straw about 2 feet from the open door and put his chin on his paws, watching, the same way he watched the wood stove when it was putting out good heat. Pear contracted again, hard, and I turned my attention back to her because there was no other choice. The calf was close. I could feel it. I worked the chain in the contraction and felt the calf slide another inch, and I talked to Pear in the same low, steady voice I'd been using for 6 hours. And from the corner of my eye, the dark shape at the door did not move. We stayed like that, the creature and I and the labouring heifer and the old dog in the yellow lantern light, for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. I did not look directly at the door again during that stretch. I looked at Pear and I worked, and I was aware of the shape in the doorway the way you are aware of a window when there is something outside it, a peripheral knowledge that changes the quality of the room without demanding your eyes. Near 4 in the morning, Pear gave one long, full contraction, and the calf came. It came out in a rush the way they do when the passage finally clears, and I had my hands on the calf's legs, and I lowered it into the straw, and I pulled the membrane from its face, and the calf shook its head, and Pear turned around on her hind legs and began licking it with the single-minded urgency that new mothers have. And I sat back on my heels in the straw, and I put my face in my hands for a moment, not crying, just done. Just empty in the good way that comes when something hard is finished, and the thing that needed to be born has been born. I looked up at the door. The doorway was empty. Not in the way a room is empty after someone slams out of it, in the way a field is empty at first light, quiet and settled and itself. The door was still open about a foot. The cold air moved again, easy and ordinary. Rue was still sitting in the same spot, and he turned his head and looked at me, and then he put his chin back on his paws and closed his eyes. I sat with Pear and the calf until first light. I did not sleep. I checked the calf's legs and got him nursing and put fresh straw down and refilled the water bucket and did all the ordinary things. And the whole time there was a quality to the barn I did not have a name for. Something that felt less like cold and more like the aftermath of warmth, a remnant of something that had been present and was now gone, the way sound is gone after a bell stops ringing. The sun was coming up grey and flat when I walked out. I'm not sure what I expected to find or if I expected anything. My mind was still mostly in the barn, still mostly on the heifer and the calf, and I was tired in a deep way. The kind of tired that is past the reach of coffee. I walked to the fence line to check the post, the way I sometimes did in the mornings. It was a Sunday. It was not a ritual check. The cornbread was not out yet because I had not baked it. The stone was on the post. Palm-sized, flat, grey riverstone, placed on the flat top of that cedar post with a precision that did not come from accident. Riverstones do not arrive on fence posts on their own. The creek that ran along the east edge of the 42 acres was 200 yards through timber. I knew every rock I'd thrown or stacked or cleared in 18 months on this land, and this stone was not one I had handled. I picked it up. It fit in my palm the way the heel of a cornbread loaf fits in a palm. That same rough, smooth weight of something warm that has gone a little cool. I stood there at the fence post for a long time. I don't have a word for what I felt. I have been looking for one ever since. What I can tell you is that it was not fear, and it was not the specific grief I had been carrying like a stone in my own chest for 18 months. And it was not happiness in any ordinary sense. It was something closer to the feeling you get when you realize you have not been as alone as you thought, and the scale of what has been watching is larger than anything you were prepared to account for. Della would have known what to call it. She had words for things I didn't have words for. I set the stone back on the post. I went inside and I made cornbread, lopsided the way I always made it, and I broke off the heel and brought it back out and placed it on the post next to the stone. I did not think about it. My hands did it the same way they had done it every Sunday for 18 months. Then I went back inside and I sat at the kitchen table and I looked at the phone for the first time in a long time. And I thought about Wren. My daughter and I had not talked properly in over a year. The estrangement had edges I was still too tired to trace clearly, but the shape of it was this. Grief had made me sharp and then gone quiet, and Wren had tried twice to reach through both, and both times I had given her so little of myself that she had stopped reaching. I did not blame her for that. I understood it. I had done the same to her that the hard season did to me. I had become someone who could not be gotten to, and she was a practical woman, and she had stopped trying to get to someone who wasn't making it possible. I picked up the phone. My hands were still rough from the night. the sleeve marks still on my forearm where the OB sleeve had pressed. The call rang 4 times, and I thought she wouldn't pick up. And I thought, that was probably fair. She picked up. I said, "Ren," and then nothing for a moment. She said, "Dad." I said, "I had a hard night. Pear's calf came, both fine." And then I said, "I've been wanting to call for a while." She said, "I know." I said, "I should have called sooner." "I did not have any more than that." She said, "Yeah." And then she said, "I'm glad the calf came." We talked for 11 minutes. It was not a long call, and it was not a call that fixed things, but it was the call that made fixing things possible, which is not nothing. When I hung up, I sat in the kitchen a little longer, and the house felt a few degrees less like a place I was just living inside, until I could work myself into the ground. The calf, which I named River for reasons I didn't have to think about, grew well through April. Pear turned out to be a patient mother, which heifers sometimes aren't. The 42 acres moved into spring the way they always did, with the particular messy optimism of mud and birdsong, and the ash trees leafing out last, always last, their cautions something I have always respected. I kept up the cornbread on Sundays. I kept the stone on the post beside it. I went back out to the barn one morning in late April and stood in the doorway and looked at the place where the threshold was, the line where the straw ended and the packed dirt outside began. And I tried to remember the exact height the creature had filled the frame, and found that I could not hold it precisely, the way you cannot hold the exact colour of a sunset 2 weeks after you've seen it. What stayed was not the image, but the feeling of it, that patient weight of attention in the dark. Calvin came by in April with a tin of his wife's rhubarb cake and stood at the gate long enough to hear about the calf. He said first-time heifers were a gamble, and I'd done right to stay with her. I thanked him, and he nodded and climbed back in his truck in the way he had of making exits before they became conversations. I watched him drive down the gravel and thought about the OB sleeves sitting 2 days before the labour started. And I thought about the way small necessities arrive when they need to sometimes. And I did not say any of this to Calvin, because there was no way to say it that wouldn't sound like more than a man like him wanted to hear. Ren came in June, drove up from the south, stayed 4 days. She slept in the room that used to be hers when she was young enough to stay summers, and she helped me repair the fence along the west side, and she cooked 2 real meals in that kitchen, which had not had real meals in it since Della. She did not ask me about the stone on the fence post. She saw it. I know she saw it. But she let it sit there without asking, which was the right instinct even if she didn't know why. On her last morning, she stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard and she said, "Rue looks good." I said, "He's slowing down, but he's steady." She said, "Mum would have liked that stone on the post." I did not say anything right away. Then I said, "Yeah, she would have." That was all either of us said about it. Now it's been months past that March night, near enough to a full turn of the year that I have watched the property go from late spring through a dry summer and into the particular gold grey of this October. River is a good-sized calf now, heavy through the shoulders, nothing like the slick, wet thing I lifted out of the straw at 4 in the morning. Pear watches him with the mild suspicion that cows have for their own calves once they've gotten large enough to be inconvenient. I'm not a person who believes easily in things I cannot put my hands on. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to me that you understand who is telling you this. 6 years working dairy taught me to account for things practically, and the 42 acres taught me to read weather and animals through patient observation and not through feeling, and nothing in my life before. That March had given me any reason to think the world contained what I saw in the doorway of my barn. I had every reason to find a different explanation, and I tried. I tried 3 separate explanations over the days after, and each one failed in a specific place I could not argue past. The first was that it had been a bear, which failed because of the height and the way it stood upright, without the forward lean a bear carries. The second was that it had been exhaustion playing shapes on the dark, which failed because Rue had seen it too, and Rue was not a dog who invented things. The third was that I had imagined the stone in some fog of tiredness, which failed the moment I picked it up and held its weight and felt the precision of its placement. So I stopped explaining. What I know is what I saw and what I found, and what I found was a stone placed on a post where my wife had placed warmth every Sunday for years before I took it up, placed there by something that had no language I know and no obligation toward me, sometime in the hours I was kneeling in the straw bringing a life into the world. What I know is that Rue was not afraid, and I have trusted that dogs read on things for 9 years, and he has not been wrong yet. Grief doesn't leave. I want to say that plainly too, because the channels that tell you it leaves have not been honest with you. It stays, but it can change shape over time, and what I have found is that the shape mine has now is different from the shape it had through those first 18 months. It has more room in it. It is still heavy, but it does not press the same way. I make full meals now most evenings. I sat in Della's chair on the porch for the first time in October, just as the light was going, and I stayed there until the cold came up from the grass. There are things I don't say to people in town, and there are things I don't put words to even in my own head most days, and the night of the labour is mostly in the second category. I said a few sentences about it to Calvin out at the fence line last month, and he listened, and he didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said, "First calf heifers are a hard night alone." And he was right, and that was the whole conversation. I was not insulted. It is a hard thing to bring into ordinary daylight. If you have had a moment like that, a moment that permanently changed what you understood the world to be allowed to contain, I think you know why the telling takes so long. Leave a comment if you have. I read them. It matters to know you're not the only one carrying something you can't fully explain. Rue comes out with me every Sunday morning now for the cornbread. He did not used to do this. For 18 months he stayed on the porch while I walked to the fence post, not from laziness, but from some dog sense that that particular walk was mine. But since March he has been coming along, the two of us walking the short distance across the yard to the cedar post in the early morning. And I break off the heel of the cornbread and set it down, and the grey riverstone sits there beside it on the flat top of the post, still in the same position it was in that first morning, because I have never moved it. In the evenings, when the work is done and the light goes low and copper over the tree line to the west, Rue walks out to the fence post on his own and lies down in the grass beside it. He puts his grey muzzle on his paws and he watches the timber line, and he does not bark and he does not stir, and he stays there until I call him in. I have stopped wondering what he sees. The stone is still there on the post. The heel of the cornbread is gone by Monday morning, the way it always has been, the way Della always said it would be. Something is always watching the property.